know that you're watching over us?
Americans are pausing to remember the nearly 3,000 lives lost in the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001. Ceremonies marking the event are being held today in New York, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon.
These Americans were brave, strong, and united in ways that shocked the terrorists.
I'm Jonathan Jared Soppy here in the H&N Digital Center. I'm compiling all the tributes that are happening here at home and across the nation. Over the next several minutes, myself and our team of reporters will be sharing those with you in this special report. But let's begin with Karen Caifa, who's live in New York City.
The day here at the 9/11 Memorial started with that private ceremony for families and invited dignitaries, and it will end much the way it looks right now, with people continuing to pour in and pay their respects, many of them leaving flowers and tokens next to each of the nearly 3,000 names that are etched in it. Earlier today, there were a number of speeches given at commemorations across the country, with many of them keying on that theme of American unity that seemed to be so strong in the days after the attacks, but now seems so distant. Steeped in one tragedy, the nation mourning 20 years since another.
Not a day goes by that I don't think about my father and the horrible way that he was taken from me.
After the pandemic put a pause to ceremonies last year, the tradition of loved ones reading the name of each life lost returned to New York's Ground Zero for the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks. 3 presidents and first ladies joining families coming together in honor and remembrance of lost loved ones, including President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, who paid respects at all 3 sites. At the Pentagon, a massive American flag draped down the side of the building before names of victims were read aloud.
It is our responsibility to remember, and it is our duty to defend democracy.
And in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, former President George W. Bush, commander-in-chief on the day of the attacks, called on Americans to confront the nation's current threat, domestic terrorism.
There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit.
At Ground Zero, families of the victims had the memorial to themselves after the morning ceremony. More time to reflect on September 11th then and now. And a beautiful blue sky day here in New York City has now turned into a very clear night sky, perfect for viewing the tribute and light that has come to adorn the night sky over New York City each 9/11 anniversary. Those 2 streams of light shooting into the sky 4 miles high that are meant to reflect the 2 twin towers that once stood here. Live in New York tonight, I'm Karen Caifa. Now back to you.
Let's get to some of the tributes from here at home. This morning, around the same time as the attacks, an overhead announcement was made at Honolulu's airport, informing passengers and officers that activities at the TSA checkpoint would be suspended temporarily. TSA observed a moment of silence, and a lei was placed on a plaque dedicated to the memories of those lives lost.
For TSA, it's particularly important because we were established as after the results of the September 11th attacks. So for us, it's got a little bit more special meaning.
Well, as we all know, in the wake of the September 11th tragedy, airports across the country implemented new security upgrades. Our Rick Daysog takes a look at all the changes.
The day the 9/11 attacks were carried out, Peter Foreman was a pilot with TWA, scheduled to fly from San Jose to St. Louis, then on to Washington, D.C., where a hijacked American Airlines plane had just slammed into the Pentagon.
I tell you what, it was a really spooky feeling. From the pilot standpoint, you like to have control over the situation. You like to have a plan B. And the fact that we had people break into the cockpits of the airplane, that was a very spooky feeling.
Like all other domestic flights, Foreman's flight was grounded before takeoff. But even when service resumed several days later, passengers were jittery.
People were definitely on edge. So a lot of us who were pilots, we would go out and we would actually introduce ourselves to the passengers out in the waiting area.
To prevent future terrorist attacks in America, airport security nationwide was beefed up considerably after 9/11. The Transportation Security Administration was created in November of 2001. It now screens some 2 million passengers every day.
Flying became more of a hassle. People carrying their bags on board, getting screened much more carefully, shoes and liquids, limitations there. So it's huge changes all around.
Passengers recall how much easier it was to fly before 9/11. The days when you can go through security to say goodbye at the gate are long gone.
I sort of remember going through some kind of metal detector, even pre 9/11, but you don't remember the horrific lines. They were faster and they were more efficient. And I think I recall people were friendlier because there wasn't the same tension.
Even more changes arrived at the airports during the recent pandemic, but Foreman believes that the security measures for COVID-19, such as vaccine passports, quarantine requirements, and thermal scans, won't be permanent like those implemented after 9/11.
I think, at some point the pandemic goes away. I mean, every pandemic we've had in the past over hundreds of years, they always go away eventually.
Rick Daysog, Hawaii News Now.
Here's something we have published to our H&N digital platforms. We've posted several documentaries about the attacks and how they changed the country forever. You can read in-depth profiles about the victims from the islands at hawaiinewsnow.com. We have a special page published there. David Lachak is one of those profiles.
It was basically just a normal day. Woke up and went to the bus stop, took the bus to school. We're getting let out early, and they called it a code red. So I come home and all my family's there, and but my dad's not home. He was a civilian budget analyst for the Department of the Army. When you think of, what a dad, kind of is and, should be, and kind of, the way you see dads, in the movies, that's kind of, what he was. And, I don't say that lightly. Some of my best memories are him coming home and playing basketball with me after work. And, I think that was really kind of what drove him to work for the government, and being able to kind of have that time, and when the end of the day hit, he knew that he was coming home, and that we were going to play whatever it was. And I think it's kind of that is really embodies who he was, and that family was really important. Basically just a normal day. Woke up and went to the bus stop, took the bus to school, and I think I guess probably midday. I remember there was all we really knew as kids was we're getting let out early, and they called it a code red. And so I come home, and all my family's there, and but my dad's not home, and I'm kind of people are just telling me not to worry about it. You know how it is when you're a kid. I think kind of a couple days after, they were looking for my dad, and just as they were kind of going through things at the actual Pentagon, they weren't quick to call things, and so obviously there people were holding out hope as much as they could. And I think a week later they had come across things, and they could make that call definitively. And at that time, I think it was there was a priest that was there, and a military chaplain, as some Army representatives, and DOD officials that were just kind of that's the role that they had at that time, and it was kind of breaking that news. My obviously, my sister, my mom, and I are incredibly close because of that, and had lost my dad, my best friend, and just kind of one of those things that you don't ever kind of truly move on, but you just kind of learn to cope more each day, and carry on with your life the way that they would want you to. Being here in New York is feeling like, even though I don't really have any memories of like coming here with my dad or anything like that, but just that, I can go down to like the memorial here where, the World Trade Centers were, and, they have the museum and everything now, and see my dad's name, and, kind of there's something that I definitely appreciated, about that being in New York. There's always like tourists and things, and kind of just, where it's positioned on that corner, people are always kind of like taking pictures and things like that. And it's kind of something that's, really kind of obviously kind of interesting in a way, that kind of knowing that, his name will be part of people's memories of coming to New York. I have this bracelet like with my dad's name. It's kind of faded now, but it says David W. Lachek and 9/11/01 Pentagon. And, and that's something that I wear, I never really take off. And it's just kind of keeping that memory alive, and really making sure to never forget.
I overslept, something that I don't normally do, but I did, and it saved my life.
20 years after the attacks, we caught up with Jennifer Ablon, a Hawaii native living in New York City who was supposed to be at a conference at the World Trade Center the morning of 9/11.
I'm more grateful for my family and for my friends, and I think more than ever, I counted my blessings, and I've never taken anything for granted. I think I've become stronger, better, and more aware of my surroundings.
She says the anniversary reminds her not to take anything or anyone for granted. Due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, there weren't many large gatherings for ceremonies here locally, but Governor Ige took to social media and said this.
Like many residents in Hawaii who woke up to the horror unfolding in New York City, I too will always remember this day for the nearly 3,000 Americans who perished in the World Trade Center, and for the courage and display of heroism by the first responders who put their lives in danger to protect the communities they serve. Today, we pause to remember all those affected by the tragic event 20 years ago, and honor the memories of the lives lost, including at least 9 people with Hawaii ties. Michael Collins, Patricia Kolodner, Miley Halle, Richard Keene, Richard Lee, Heather Malia Ho, Georgine Corrigan, David Lachek, and Christine Snyder. Their legacy is now etched in our collective memory and will live on through stories passed down to future generations. We owe our brave first responders a debt of gratitude for continuing to serve our community through times of crisis, including the current COVID-19 pandemic. Together as a state and nation, we'll persevere and thrive, for we are at our best when we come together as one. One nation, one state, one ohana.
Mayor Rick Blangiardi also posted this virtual ceremony. The mayor had this message to share.
It's hard to believe that so much time has passed since that terrible day. People are going to college now who weren't even born yet when the towers fell. Yet to many others, that terrible moment feels just like yesterday. Now we remember, and we may never forget where we were and what we were doing when we heard the news that day. But to the survivors, that day doesn't live in the past. It very much lives in the present. Now the pain may grow duller, but it never goes away. And while time may heal all wounds, the scars will always remain. And for many, their memories of that day have nothing to do with watching the news. They remember the last words they spoke to their loved one as they walked out the door, or how they looked that morning, or maybe even a final departing hug or a kiss. And they never knew that that kiss or those words would be their last. For Americans, that day was the most significant loss of life since Pearl Harbor. Now, we shared and continue to share in a collective sense of grief over such a tremendous and painful tragedy. So when we say to remember September 11th, that doesn't mean to remember the dates or numbers or a series of events. What we need to remember is our grief and what we learned from it. We need to remember how precious life is, how important it is. And so when we tell our loved one, I love you, we will never know if that will be the last time they will hear those words from us. And we need to remember our duty to our fellow man and our duty as Americans. We need to remember how our heroes stepped up and put their lives on the line to save the lives of those buried in the rubble that used to be the World Trade Center. And we also need to remember how ordinary citizens put aside their differences and came together to help one another through the worst days of their lives. And we need to remember this so that we can learn from it and grow.
Many teachers across the country are looking for ways to convey the impact of the tragedies to an entirely new generation. Skylar Henry continues our coverage.
In this spot in rural Pennsylvania, history is alive for teachers Tina Johnston and Katie Speary.
I remember what that day was like. We got out of school early.
The Flight 93 National Memorial helps Speary tell the 9/11 story to students who weren't alive to remember that day.
I think we all have that job to share our experience.
Johnston, now retired, volunteers to teach the difficult subject.
They didn't know when they got on that plane the hand that fate dealt them and how they faced it.
She brought her classes to this site where Flight 93 crashed after the passengers and crew attempted to regain control from the hijackers, weaving Shakespeare into the lesson.
We looked at the story of Hamlet. We looked at Hamlet's last words, tell my story, and this is a story that needs to be told.
The nonprofit Friends of Flight 93 helps educators tell the 9/11 story.
We work with teachers out of Florida and out of Ohio.
Danielle Miller coordinates with teachers across the country, both in person and virtually, offering students workshops and tours.
What do you think it means to be able to teach that generation who wasn't alive for 9/11?
It means keeping a promise that the nation made 20 years ago. Those of us with living memories of the event are never going to forget what September 11, 2001 was like.
You can't teach history without empathy.
Ohio middle school teacher Scott Marsh is using these tools in his classroom.
We're trying to introduce my kids to a world that's not the same now as it was back then.
Now they participate in a University of Pittsburgh study exploring how the Flight 93 Memorial and other sites resonate with children.
Kids do see the sites different than adults do, and just to rely on what an adult thinks a kid will think isn't always a good idea because the kids have different viewpoints on things.
A new generation making its own connection to a pivotal day in our nation's history. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Kalaheo High School held its annual 9/11 tribute yesterday, a somber ceremony that was held to remember alumnus Christine Snyder. Here's more on her lasting legacy.
When she was on her way back from National Urban Forestry Conference in Washington, all glued to the TV at that time watching the earlier flights that unfortunately hit the World Trade Center. We were all hoping and praying that she hadn't made that flight. Started with the Outdoor Circle in about 1994. She was very involved with was her she was the programs manager for the Outdoor Circle. And frankly, she was one of the few female arborists in the United States. So put her in a very unique position, and one of the few female arborists in Hawaii at that time. So she was in charge of many of the programs that the Outdoor Circle was involved with, planting trees, educating kids. She was really a shining light, you know, from a personality standpoint, she could light up a room. From a business standpoint, she knew a great deal about a lot of different things. So she was able to really carry the message of the Outdoor Circle in any kind of conversation that she would be involved with. So she was a very good representative for the Outdoor Circle and its message of keeping Hawaii clean, green, and beautiful. She was on her way back from National Urban Forestry Conference in Washington with our executive director, Mary Snyder. And so they had parted company in New York. Mary was on her way home, and Christine was on her way on a separate flight back to San Francisco. Unfortunately, that was Flight 93. We were hoping that she wasn't on Flight 93, but unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. So we were all hoping and praying that she hadn't made that flight. But then we did hear that, unfortunately, she had gone down on that unfortunate flight.
And the dictionary is inadequate. There aren't enough words, but I guess the range of emotion goes from rage and anger to sorrow to horror to, I guess, a sense of nausea that we all experience and feel.
It really was a light that had gone out. Like so many of the other people that were lost on that day, you never think that it's going to happen to you or one of the people you know or one of your loved ones. So yes, we were all heartbroken when we did finally get the news. Well, she influenced a lot of us at the Outdoor Circle, and because of her work, I think it was incentive for the branches to carry on that legacy. Yes, there were memorial trees planted in her honor and her memory in all of the communities in which these branches are located. And memorial funds were set up in her name that are still operating. It would have been wonderful had she had more time at the Outdoor Circle. She had a lot to give. She was so enthusiastic. If there was any kind of silver lining, is that with her work, she's one of the true environmentalists that plants the seed for the trees and never gets to sit in the shade of one of her beautiful specimen trees. And there are millions of people now that sit beneath the trees that have been planted in her honor. So hopefully that's what her legacy is the lives that she will touch in the future through the work that she has done in the past. Her work will live on well beyond her immediate lifetime.
Back in 2001, the Red Cross responded to the emergencies unfolding immediately. Our Jim Mendoza spoke to members of the Hawaii team.
After the terror attacks on September 11th, the American Red Cross sent hundreds of disaster relief workers to New York City.
This is a picture of the Red Cross volunteers.
Masaru Oshiro was one of the Hawaii volunteers assigned to Ground Zero. He supervised the mental health teams.
My job was to making sure that all my outreach teams are in good shape emotionally, and there were those that could not handle the impact of what they saw.
They counseled adults and children who lived in high-rises surrounding the Trade Center site and who saw the towers come down.
Some would be crying, some would be looking for blame, who to blame.
They would stay to the point that they dropped.
Glenn Lockwood was there for 2.5 months, overseeing the support system for emergency workers who searched the rubble for signs of life.
And that meant that we needed to find some way to provide a respite center for all of the workers.
He can't remember crying as much as he did during that disaster.
You think you're okay, and then you see a family, and they're unconsolable.
The Hawaii chapter sent 80 Red Cross volunteers to New York. Some deployed more than once.
They absolutely wanted to go and to give in any way they could. And so we had a huge response.
The grieving, as we know from the families of 9/11, continues today.
Lockwood was deputy director for the operation that oversaw the viewing station, where victims' relatives could look on what was left of the World Trade Center.
Until they could see it, they had a hard time comprehending why people couldn't say that they could find their loved one.
Hawaii's Red Cross volunteers used what they learned in New York to improve their crisis counseling for other emergencies.
These are the towers, and these are the high-rises around Ground Zero.
Oshiro put together a book that reminds him of what he did at Ground Zero, and he has his field cap embroidered with a date he will never forget. Jim Mendoza, Hawaii News Now.
You might have noticed this. Governor Ige has ordered flags to fly at half-staff today. Across the nation, Americans are marking the 20th anniversary in different ways. At Boston Logan International Airport, TSA agents also paused screening passengers at 8:46 this morning to remember those who passed away. Both hijacked planes that hit the north and south towers of the World Trade Center took off from Boston. In Chicago, police, firefighters, and other city employees attended a 9/11 memorial ceremony at Daley Plaza. In Florida, the governor took part in a memorial service and praised first responders who worked to save lives during the attacks and those who went to war to bring those responsible to justice.
We honor them. We honor the memories of those who we lost. We are inspired by the stories of so many survivors who have, many of them have moved to Florida in the intervening years, as a lot of people have. And so we are inspired by their stories, and we are sad, even now 20 years later, but we're also appreciative about the response and so many people who stood up to say, not on my watch, this is not going to happen.
Thousands of first responders served at Ground Zero, and now many are suffering from severe health conditions because of toxic exposure. Elise Preston has more on that.
Former NYPD Detective Barbara Burnett tried to save as many lives as she could on September 11th.
The air was so thick and dusty that if you saw like EMS around, they had bottled water, you just had to pour it on your face, pour it on your eyes, and keep going. It didn't matter that we couldn't see or breathe. We just knew we had to help.
Burnett worked on the pile at Ground Zero for weeks, and like many first responders, her heroic service has cost her her health.
They said to me, you have lung disease related to 9/11, and there's no cure. I don't even think I told my family for like 3 weeks because it didn't register.
A once healthy athlete, Burnett is on oxygen and needs a wheelchair. The grandmother of 5 is also battling lung cancer. She is among more than 81,000 responders in treatment programs around the country and one of more than 14,000 cases of 9/11 related cancer.
The opportunity for those folks to breathe in poisonous materials was there from the very beginning and stayed there as long as that pile stayed on fire and as long as they are moving large amounts of dust.
Dr. Michael Crane is the medical director of the World Trade Center Health Program at Mount Sinai. Data also shows 27,000 responders suffer with chronic rhinosinusitis, more than 25,000 with gastroesophageal disease or GERD, and 13,000 with asthma.
These are chronic conditions. They need chronic long-term care, and we're just blessed to have the expertise.
Dr. Crane says post-traumatic stress and other mental issues exacerbate those physical conditions. Burnett has testified before Congress advocating for other first responders.
Day to day, it's very hard. I can't do any of the things I used to do.
You made it your life's work to help people, and now you need people to help you.
Yes, it's just very hard because I still want to help.
She says she shares her story to remind Americans that people are sick from the sacrifices they made and they need help. Elise Preston, CBS News, New York.
Wanted to introduce you now to Ramel Gopez. He's the director of guest relations at New York's Edison Hotel. He's a former Hawaii resident, and he's lived in New York since 1994. Our High Now crew that's in New York City talked to him about how the city has bonded and is doing 20 years later.
I mean, the city is alive as far as I'm concerned. I mean, as of right now, due to the pandemic, Broadway is slowly coming back, but it's back. New York City is back. It's strong as ever. Working at the Hotel Edison, I bring my aloha spirit because mainly I'm in the lobby. So as soon as those doors open, I have that aloha spirit and the smile to greet everybody. So, hey, come to New York, the island of Manhattan. It's like Hawaii.
Thanks for watching this special report as we remember 9/11 20 years later. We want to end with a special song that was produced by 3 HPD officers. I'm going to play it out now.
If tomorrow all the things were gone I worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away.
And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
From the slopes of Mauna Kea to the shores of Hilo Bay, across the plains of Ewa, where little Hawaiian children play. From Lihue down to Lahaina, Hana to Hanalei. Oh, there's pride in every Hawaiian heart, and we're proud to stand up and say, 'cause I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the